What is going on, guys? Pal in the shop, and tonight an update on my 383 stroker turbo non-intercooled small block Chevy. Let's check it out. So several weeks ago now, I dyno tested my 383 stroker here. And I wasn't happy with the results. Basically what ended up happening is the engine's fine. The engine is, nothing catastrophic went wrong. But the issue we were running into on the dyno, the engine sounded great, but we were running into back pressure issues, basically the power falling off. If you're not familiar with this engine, I've talked about it a few times, but if you're new here, it's a 383 stroker. This is going to go in my 3rd gen Trans Am. And that's kind of why it's packaged the way it's packaged. A lot of guys are going to say, why don't you run an intercooler? Why don't you run? Well, if you're familiar with the 3rd gen Trans Ams, the airflow is not great to begin with. So if I'm going to run an intercooler, it would be an air to water intercooler. But I decided I'm not going for crazy horsepower goals. And I've done this before with supercharger stuff. I used to run a blower on the car, and you can get away with a certain horsepower level before you needing an intercooler. I'm not saying an intercooler won't help. In almost every case, an intercooler will help make power. But when we're talking about a certain package and a cleanliness and stuff, I just wanted to run non-intercooler. I also think it's a little entertaining how bent out of shape guys get when you don't run an intercooler. It's like, it's kind of like, man, you can do what you want. If you guys don't want to run an intercooler, don't. But the tuning window and fuel requirements and things like that and power limitations become different when you're not running an intercooler. So just keep that in mind. I am running meth injection though. I have an injector going right into the turbo here, and I'll also run another nozzle under here, even though it's located right here right now. I think I'm going to move it to a different spot. Either way, when we were dyno testing this, air temperature wasn't a problem. I've since then also relocated an air temp sensor in the intake away from the air, basically the air movement, because what can happen, and I'm getting sidetracked here, but what can happen with air temp sensors and when running meth or blow through applications like we're running here is the sensor gets saturated and gives you a false cold reading on your data log. So it's like putting rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer on your hand and waving it around. It feels really cold, but the ambient air temperature around it really isn't that cold. So I've moved the sensor out of the path, tucked back in the back of the intake here. So it's going to be interesting what kind of readings I get. I've also put in a really good Rife sensor in there, so it's really fast and accurate. So we'll find out when we dyno test this again in a couple. But I wanted to talk about the changes I've done. So like I was saying, the power fell off. I got to about, you get about 5,100, 5,300 around there, and the power, that was it. We made with the just over 600 horsepower. So it seemed like around the 600 horsepower, that RPM, that was it. So as we started turning up the boost, the torque was jumping up, but the power would just fall off at the same point. There gets to a point when you're on the dyno and you're like, that's it. We have to make major changes. Tuning, little things are not going to get us there. We need to start doing component changes. So the update we've done is I've decided to go to a VS Racing 7875 versus the old turbo was on 37875. And the big difference between the two of those is the exhaust, the turbine side of the turbo. The exhaust housing went from a 96 AR to a 125 AR, and there is quite bigger. The downside is I do have to run a 3-inch downpipe on here, so I am reducing it down to a 3-inch downpipe. So it's not, you're not really utilizing the bigger exhaust housing, but I'm hoping it's just going to make it that little bit better for back pressure to just get another at least 1,000 RPM out of this thing. The other thing I changed is I went to a camshaft upgrade on this bad girl. So I went to a much larger camshaft. than before. The cam I knew was on kind of a smaller side, and I ran this camshaft with a centrifugal blower before, and the car would run 11s. But it wasn't really an engine that revved out too good, and I wanted to get a little bit more RPM and then shift down the torque on this thing, because with the turbo, the old setup, it was making like 650 foot-pounds of torque at just past 3,000 RPM, which is crazy. This is a small tire car I'm running, and there's no way that I'm not going to have traction issues. So I went to a turbo cam. And before everyone gets bent out of shape about a turbo cam, the reason I wanted this cam is it had the specs I wanted, and it had a really wide lobe separation. And the reason I did that, I was hoping that it would shift the peak power up sort of where I wanted it, and kind of actually reduce low end torque. Because I'm going for a very simple setup here. I'm not going to be running any fancy traction control, nothing like that. I am going for simplicity. As you can see, we're running the throttle body injection, not even port injection. This is honestly one step up from turbocharged blow-through carb application, which works fine too. A lot of guys are running turbo blow-through carbs, and they just take a certain amount of tuning, a certain amount of finesse. That's why I run the Sniper, but it's all a preference. And then really at the end of the day, you can make things work, and everyone has opinions on how you should do things, but with tuning and tweaking, and we can all hit, as long as they're realistic goals, we can make things work. It doesn't have to be all cookie cutter and the same. And that's, I guess, why I still run a small block Chevy and not go LS, because a lot of guys, tell me I should just go LS. And a couple of things is I don't like being told what to do, I guess. And I still like the Gen 1 small block, and I probably always will. I know there's going to be some comments about that. So that's where we're at with this. Are we going to be able to hit the north of 700 horsepower? And I guess that's my goal, and I didn't mention that yet. Sorry. Is to run what I want to run with my car and have some fun with it, is I know I have to be north of 700 horsepower. I'm not shooting for 1,000 horsepower. This is a stock block, and I don't know if a lot of you guys know that. We're still running a stock 638 block. It's got main studs. It's half filled with hard block up to the bottom of the water jackets here. The block has been prepped a little bit for boost, but it is still a stock block with stock main caps. So I'm not shooting for 1,000 horsepower. I would just like to make a clean 700 to 800 horsepower and rev it out and nice and clean up to 6,500 plus RPM. That's the hope. So we'll see what it ends up doing. And if it makes what it makes, that's good. And then I can drop this thing over the winter and hopefully get this thing down the track in the spring. That's kind of the plan. That's why I was trying to scramble to get this all, new turbo, new cam, get it all back ready for the dyno.